On October 23rd, 1856, we were a weather-beaten and starving band of pioneers, struggling up the brutal mountain corridor in Wyoming known as Rocky Ridge. In the best weather, the climb was difficult. In the teeth of the blizzard of the century, it was near impossible. For my father, this trek up Rocky Ridge would be the culminating moment of his life, a place where faith, self-sacrifice, and a devotion to God and family would intersect. Having traveled thousands of miles over oceans of water, vast empty plains, and mountains of stone, Ole Madsen would lay down his life to help his family survive this final leg of the journey. Before the arrival of the 19th century, freedom of expression was severely limited in our native nation of Denmark. But with the dawn of the 1800s came new ideas, new freedoms, and enlightenment. My father was born on February 14, 1815, in Holstrup, Holbæk, the illegitimate child of a tailor, Christian Jacobsen Leike, and Anna Lardsdottir. At 14, Ole left home to find work. Life was hard and there was little to distinguish the dreary days from one another, until someone came into his world who would change his life forever. On the 21st of July, 1837, at the age of 22, Ole married Anna Jensdottir. Anna was a widow with 4 children. She and Ole would have 6 more children: Karen, Joanna Marie, Mette Christina, Anders, who died just a few weeks after he was born, Andrew, and myself, Anna Marie. To the Danish island of Zealand, in the town of Tornved, came foreign preachers. These Americans proclaimed a message of newly discovered scripture, miracles, heavenly visitations, and a Christianity restored to its roots and authority on the earth. They also spoke of a new world under a government where individual freedoms were guaranteed to all, a place where a new Zion was being created. My parents listened to these Mormon missionaries and felt moved to join the church. Ole and Anna were baptized members in 1853. My parents opened their home and their hearts to the missionaries, feeding and housing them and holding branch meetings. Though there were new freedoms in Denmark, it was far from an open and tolerant society. At times, meetings of our little Latter-day Saint branch were disrupted by mobs, and we found our home frequently pelted with rotten eggs by those who disliked the believers in this foreign religion. Because of our affiliation with the Mormons, we were forbidden to attend school and were ostracized by other children. Then in 1856, the call came. Come to Zion. With help from the Perpetual Immigration Fund, we prepared to leave Tornved and begin our journey to Zion. In March of 1856, our family left for Copenhagen.
When the Lord calls His saints to do anything, if they will rely upon Him and do the best they can, He will fit the back to the burden and make everything bend to the accomplishments of His purposes.
We left Denmark on April 23, 1856, by the steamship Rhoda to Germany, then on to England. There we boarded the Thornton, bound for America. The Danish saints were given the lower deck. The quarters were crowded and cramped, so my father slept on deck with the men and older boys, while the rest of us stayed in a cabin. When the ship reached open sea, almost everyone got seasick. The journey across the Atlantic was both an adventure and a hardship, as most of us had never been more than a few miles from villages where we were born. There were births, deaths, strong gales, heavy seas, icebergs, and once even a fire on board. Through all of this, we kept our eyes on the goal ahead and continued to be hardworking and organized. The usual routine was that at the signal of a bugle or the ship's bell, the saints rose, cleaned their quarters, had prayer, and breakfasted in assigned groups. During fair weather, talks by the elders and prayer meetings were held on the deck. It was common to sing and to dance.
10 o'clock. The Scandinavian saints gathered for worship. Elders Amundsen, Svensson, and Larsen delivered sermons and encouraged us to preserve a good spirit in love and unity. The good weather caused the company to be happy, and they rejoiced in song. 4 brethren made music to which there was dancing on the deck.
We were united and felt contented as possible under the circumstances. The captain of the ship noted that great order prevailed. We arrived in New York at Castle Garden on June 14th.
6 o'clock. The land of America came into view, which produced universal happiness and a deck full of people.
After a journey by rail, we arrived in Iowa on June 26th and began preparations to leave for Utah. 5 handcart companies crossed the plains in 1856. The first 3 arrived in Iowa City in April and May. Church agents equipped them, gave them some rudimentary training, and sent them on their way. Our arrival, so late in the season, caught them unprepared and short of precious resources.
We expected to find these handcart vehicles already at hand on our arrival at Iowa City.
Nonetheless, the saints set about making preparations. My father, Ole, and the rest of our family worked hard to ready ourselves for the long journey. Everybody in the camp appeared to be busy making handcarts, yokes, etc., and the sisters helped to make tents. Seasoned wood was scarce, and the handcarts were now made of green wood. The delays grew longer, and many weeks were lost before our handcart company could get on the trail.
In the morning, we bathed in a little river or large stream which crosses through meadow and woods. Here the sisters have a good opportunity to wash and clean. The freedom that one has here is not known in Denmark. The company had shooting practice and assemblies in order to celebrate the day that the North American people won their freedom and a constitution.
Finally, the day arrived. We prepared to make the trek to Zion.
Orders were given to pack up. We are happy that the time is near for the journey to continue. We will gather experiences that will follow us into eternity. The Lord will bless and preserve the faithful who will do His will.
In all its history, the American West never saw a more unlikely band of pioneers. Most of them, until they were herded from their crowded immigrant ship, had never pitched a tent, slept on the ground, cooked outdoors, or built a campfire. They had not even the rudimentary skills that make frontiersmen.
The Willie Handcart Company consisted of 500 people, 120 handcarts, and wagons to carry tents and provisions. We also had oxen and cattle. On July 15th, our company of pioneers departed Iowa City.
It was quite an interesting sight to see the carts roll out in their several divisions and to see the people in such good faith. Although the plains had never been crossed by handcarts, yet they believed they could accomplish it.
For our group of saints heading into a wild frontier, the start of our journey was rocky. On the first full day, we managed to move only 3 miles. For a while, 6 or 7 miles a day was all we could endure. But as we became hardened to the strenuous labors of the trail, we traveled farther, 14 miles a day, then 18. And this in spite of the rough conditions and searing heat. On one day, the Danish saints misunderstood the plans for a 14-mile march, and we traveled 21 miles instead.
The company was cheerful and happy. It was difficult to keep the train together in the assigned order because many tried to pass one another.
The best evidence of their sincerity is the fact that they are willing to endure the fatigues and privations of a journey so lengthy. This is heroism indeed.
We arrived in Florence, Nebraska with the rest of the Willie Company on August 11th. It became increasingly apparent that the lateness of the season might be a significant problem for our handcart company. Those familiar with the journey to the Salt Lake Valley urged our company to winter in Nebraska.
We're liable to have to wade in snow up to our knees and shall at night wrap ourselves in a thin blanket and lie on the frozen ground without a bed. We cannot cross the mountains with a mixed company of aged people, women and little children so late in the season without much suffering, sickness, and death.
Most people, however, felt that we should press on.
The immigrants were entirely ignorant of the country and climate. Simple, honest, eager to go to Zion at once.
Some of the saints were reluctant to press forward. About 100 people chose to stay in Nebraska. The rest of us set our eyes on the goal of reaching Zion.
Seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you. Will help you all I can. Will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in His mercy bless and preserve us.
On the 17th of August, the Willie Company left Florence and the last vestiges of civilization behind. We were on the trail once more. Now we were truly headed into a wild and untamed land. Though we avoided many of the dangers of the trail, it was the daily grind that began to take its toll.
We continued our toil day after day, pulling our handcarts with our provisions or rations, our little children, etc., through deep sands, rocky roads, or fording streams. It was a dreary journey.
On August 19th, we reached the Elkhorn River.
We camped by a stream where we found good water and good grazing for the cattle. 8 o'clock prayer gathering. Brother Amundsen gave a sermon and warning to those who are disorderly in their work. Ole Madsen borrowed 20 cents for hooks and line.
We pressed on into the unknown. Only our hope and faith in Almighty God to sustain us.
We traveled several miles over hill and dale and saw buffalo by the thousands. During the noon hour, Ole Madsen shot a large buffalo and an Englishman another.
As the unseasoned lumber dried out and shrank, our handcarts began to break down. The grit of sand and rocks began to take their toll on the wheels and axles.
The only drawback to this part of the journey were the constant breaking down of the carts and delays caused by repairing them.
Our troubles soon worsened. On the night of September 3rd, we lost most of our oxen. With the meager food stores we had left, we teetered on the edge of disaster.
We hunted for our livestock 3 days in every direction, but did not find them.
Before prayer, we held council in which it was decided that the handcarts should be loaded with sacks of flour and tents from the wagons. We can't move too fast, but necessity dictates that we traverse the wild waste, where we are surrounded by wild people and animals, as fast as possible.
Though we could not know it, this event would be the cause of the final delay that would lead us to tragedy. With the ever-lengthening season, time was of the essence, but our Willie Company was now moving at a crippled pace and on shortened rations. As the nights became colder, it became apparent that we were in a race against the coming winter. We discarded everything that was surplus weight, including all our bedding and the family Bible with our records written in it. We had to throw them all away on the plains. I can yet close my eyes and see everything in panoramic precision before me. The ceaseless walking, ever to remain in my memory. Many times I would become so tired and childlike would hang on the cart, only to be gently pushed away.
We now began to see buffalo off from the road. I got impatient at the distant view of them, so I went out for a hunt. I chased a herd 4 or 5 miles, shot at them, but to no effect. I had to return to camp with only a prairie dog.
A soldier named Bachter arrived in our camp and reported an attack by Indians that had killed 2 men, their wives, and a child. We gave him food, even though we had little enough for ourselves. Just after dusk on September 12th, Franklin D. Richards and about a dozen returning missionaries passed our Willie Company on the trail and promised to send food and supplies from Salt Lake.
On September 30th, we arrived at Fort Laramie, having necessarily expended considerable time in the repair of handcarts.
Hoping to resupply, we were sorely disappointed. Due to the lateness of the season, Fort Laramie had little in the way of food and could only provide a couple of barrels of hard bread and a bit of bacon. Soon we were on the trail again.
Shortly after leaving Fort Laramie, it became necessary to shorten our rations that they might hold out and that the company be not reduced to starvation. The reduction was repeated several times. We pushed ahead.
It was ascertained that at our present rate of travel and consumption of flour, the latter would be exhausted when we were about 350 miles from our destination.
Our old people are nearly all failing fast.
My father and the other men soon began sacrificing their own small portions in an attempt to buoy up their families.
The men gave most of the food to the children and the women, and I can remember yet seeing my father and the other men go away, so they could not smell the food cooking and so they would not be hungry.
We resorted to eating anything that could be chewed, even bark and leaves of trees. We youngsters ate the rawhide from our boots. This seemed to sustain life.
Exhausted, near starvation, we were about to face our final challenge.
The mountains before us revealed themselves to view, mantled nearly to their base in snow, and tokens of a coming storm were discernible in the clouds, which each day seemed to lower around us.
With the breath of a northern wind, the unseasonably warm weather turned. Temperatures dropped. My father, Ole, chose to carry us across rivers to spare us from the cold water and the colder march that followed. His ragged clothing, soaked through, wouldn't dry, but instead froze on his body.
Our rations of flour was reduced from 1 pound to 12 ounces for adults, and from 8 ounces for my children to 6 ounces a day.
Some would sit down by the roadside and die. My younger sister, Carolyn, 17 years old, after traveling all day, took off her apron to tie some sagebrush in. They found her chilled and dying and carried her into camp. She was placed in an unmarked grave.
The next morning when we got up, we found the snow about 6 or 8 inches deep. The camp was hungry, naked, and cold. To rush them into the snow would be certain death to a great many of them.
Winter came all at once, and that was the first day of it.
We were overtaken by a snowstorm, which the shrill wind blew furiously about us. The snow fell several inches deep as we traveled along, but we dared not stop.
This, however, was just the first whisper of the real oncoming storm. On October the 4th, Franklin D. Richards arrived in Salt Lake and reported to Brigham Young that handcart pioneers were still out on the plains.
I shall call this day. I shall not wait until tomorrow, nor until the next day. Many of our brethren and sisters are on the plains with handcarts, and they must be brought here. Go and bring in those people.
The sisters stripped off their petticoats, stockings, and everything they could spare right there in the tabernacle.
This prophetic call to action was made weeks before the storm would trap our poor company in the wastes of Wyoming. The missionaries who had just returned with Franklin D. Richards were the first to volunteer. That same day, the rescuers met in Brigham Young's office to receive priesthood blessings before the journey.
All hoped for the best and prepared for the considerably worse.
A better outfit and one more adapted to the work before us, I do not think could have possibly been selected if a week had been spent fitting up.
We commenced our march again. Nothing much of note transpired, except people died daily.
The morning of the day on which the storm came, we issued the last ration of flour. This was equally and fairly divided among all the company.
We knew, we hoped, we prayed that the promised rescuers and supplies were on their way to us. The storm raged on, increasing in fury, day in and day out. We gathered together, some of our party to wait for help, and some to wait no more as they were called home to God in heaven.
I was 6,000 or 7,000 miles from my native land, in a wild, rocky mountain country, in a destitute condition, the ground covered with snow, the waters covered with ice, and I, with 3 fatherless children with scarcely nothing to protect them from the merciless storms.
Brother Willie, who was the captain of the company, left the charge of the camp in the hands of Brother Atwood, and we started ahead in search of our brethren. We rode 12 miles where we expected to find them, but they were not there. We ascended the rocky ridge. The snow and awful cold wind blew in our faces all day.
They were absent 3 days. 3 days which I shall never forget. The recollection of it unmans me even now. Such craving hunger I never saw before, and may God in His mercy spare me the sight again.
The same blizzard which had stopped us had stopped the rescuers as well. They had camped off the trail.
For protection of ourselves and animals, the company moved down the river to where the willows were dense enough to make a good protection against the raging storm from the north. I volunteered to take a signboard and place it at a conspicuous place at the main road. This was designed to direct the express party who were expected to return about this time, so they would not miss us.
We crossed the rocky ridge, and upon the west bank of the North Fork of the Sweetwater, we found a friendly guidepost, which pointed us to their camp down upon the Sweetwater in amongst the willows.
I had only been back to camp a short time when 2 men rode up from Willie's Handcart Company. The signboard had done the work of salvation.
Brother Willie and Brother Elder arrived in camp at about 2 o'clock in the morning. When the rescuers learned of our terrible and destitute condition, in spite of the storm, they immediately broke camp in the dark and drove toward us.
On the evening of the 3rd day, just as the sun was sinking beautifully behind the distant hills, on an eminence immediately west of our camp, several covered wagons, each drawn by 4 horses, were seen coming towards us. Shouts of joy rent the air.
When the people of the camp sighted us approaching, they set up such a shout as to echo through the hills.
We found them in a condition that would stir the hardest heart. They were out of provisions, freezing and starving to death.
The men from the valley turned over to me flour, potatoes, onions, and a limited supply of warm clothing, besides quilts, blankets, buffalo robes, woolen socks. That evening, for the first time in quite a period, the songs of Zion were to be heard in the camp.
Many declared we were angels from heaven.
Though rescue had arrived, the journey was not over. It was decided that the company should seek the shelter of Rock Creek Hollow. But between there and us lay the part of the trail known as Rocky Ridge.
On the 2nd day occurred the most terrible ordeal of the entire journey, an ascent of Rocky Ridge.
The wind blew awfully hard and cold. The ascent was steep and covered in deep snow. We became weary and sat down to rest. Some became chilled and commenced to freeze.
I had not gone far up before I overtook a cart that the folks could not pull through the snow. I helped them along, and we soon overtook another. by all hands getting to one cart, we could travel. Throughout the night, people and carts were brought into camp. 2 teams loaded with the sick, dying, and dead didn't reach camp until 5 a.m.
Ole Madsen got his family safely to Rock Creek Hollow, but character and strength could not in the end pay the price of starvation and deathly cold. My father died not just as a result of the ascent up Rocky Ridge, where freezing winds pierced his poor dear body, but because he carried his family across freezing streams, sacrificed his rations for his children, placed his family first and himself last. Ole Madsen died watching over his family and friends, his boots frozen to his feet. He was buried in an unmarked grave with 12 others, having sacrificed all in his devotion to his family and to his God, having sealed his testimony with his life.
Mother used to tell us children some of her experience. She would say, I could write a book of my life and not tell half the suffering we went through on our journey over the plains. The night her father died, the wolves howled all night. They believed the wolves had uncovered the bodies and were eating them. She told of how hard it was for her to think of such a terrible thing, and her mother now left alone with her children with nothing to eat, frozen and hungry.
No person can describe it, nor could it be comprehended or understood by any human living in this life, but those who are called to pass through it. Obedience is better than sacrifice.
As we traveled with our rescuers to the valley of the Great Salt Lake, though the resources were sufficient to keep the hardy alive, they were still never enough to truly eliminate our suffering. Words inadequately expressed our appreciation to our rescuers. They could never really understand the depth of our loss. Sometimes when the men baked flapjacks, as they used to call them, they would burn some and throw them away. My poor mother would pick these up and take them to the bushes to eat them because she was so hungry. The snow was still falling on November 6th as we made our way down Echo Canyon. At last, on Sunday, November 9th, we finally arrived in Zion.
Our toilsome journey was hard to endure, but the Lord gave us strength and courage.
At last we emerged from amongst the mountains and the beautiful valley with all of its loveliness spread out before our view. My heart was filled with joy and gratitude. The lovely city of Great Salt Lake lay about 5 miles distant in full view as we entered it. The journey was o'er at last.
I do not want to see them put into houses by themselves. I want to have them distributed in the city among the families that have good and comfortable houses. Prayer is good, but when baked potatoes and pudding and milk are needed, prayer will not supply their place.
How inadequate is language to depict or pen to write the soul-stirring pleasure and gratitude to the all-wise Creator for our safe arrival home.
Our family lived as best they could, doing whatever was necessary to keep body and soul together. My mother took Andrew and myself with her to Ephraim in San Pete County. Joanna and Christina stayed behind to work, but eventually could bear their separation from our family no longer.
We managed to get to the town of Nephi, thinking we would be able to get to Ephraim along with some people who might be going there. After several days of waiting, we found a man who was going to drive a cow to that place. We had to walk, but we wanted to be where Mother lived. When we reached the Sandpit River, the man put us astride the cow and led us to safety. Arriving at Ephraim at midnight, we went from house to find Mother and our younger brother and sister. We finally located them and found them sleeping together on the floor, covered only by a quilt. We cried for joy. Cold and hungry though we were, we were happy we were together.
Leonard Erickson penned the following words in tribute to his mother, Anna Marie Madsen. The first conscious remembrance I have of my mother is of a wonderful smile hovering over me. I found her smile was born of the Spirit. My mother's courage was not the sink or swim, live or die variety. Life to her was not a struggle or affliction, but a beautiful privilege to act and live. She loved the world and everything in it, and the great Giver for allowing her to be part of His creation. This was the secret of her smile. When I shall behold it no more in the flesh, this smile, its impress which distance cannot dim nor time efface, will still be my pilot even to life's sunset, with the assurance that whatever comes must be best and good, for God is in His heaven.
My father was a simple man. He had worked hard all his days. He responded to the quiet promptings of the Spirit and allied himself and his family with the saints of the restored Church of God on the earth. He did all that was asked and more, sacrificing his life to leave a lasting and eternal legacy. Even as it was said of Brother Joseph and Brother Hiram, my father has glory as his eternal reward. Paul said to the Romans, "By the obedience of one shall many be made righteous." Ole Madsen was that sort of man, a man who walked in obedience to God. We will never forget the gift that is to us, our children, and our children's children.
Questions asked of things I never knew. When would have I discovered the things I now believe? The answers that I've received. And we sat at the mountain's feet as the leaves fell. I remember oh so well. Questions flung skyward past the setting sun. So many choices, which is the one?
Anna Madsen was sent to live in Ephraim, and later was among the first saints to settle Mount Pleasant, Utah. She married Hans Christensen and died June 15, 1864, 7.5 years after arriving in the Salt Lake Valley. She had the courage and the strength to get her family to Utah after losing her husband on the trail, and was blessed to see her family settled in Zion. Joanna Maria Olesdotter lived with her mother in Ephraim for 2 years before moving to Mount Pleasant, where she met and fell in love with Martin Aldrich, a young convert to the church whom she married in 1860. They had 7 children. After Martin died in 1919, she remained independent and managed her own home without assistance. She was of exceptional physical vitality and mental vigor. She died on the 6th of May, 1942, in Mount Pleasant, Utah, at the age of 101. Meta Christina Olesdotter married James Christensen Harborough in 1858. They had 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys. Christina was full of faith throughout her life, uncomplaining, kind to others, and generous. teaching her children the gospel and continuing the legacy of her father with hard work, self-sacrifice, and a joyful love for those whose lives she touched. She passed away on November 15th, 1900, at Mount Pleasant, Utah, at the age of 57. Anna Maria Oldesdotter met Hans Peter Eriksson in Mount Pleasant and married him on the 4th of April, 1865. They moved to Grand Island, Nebraska. From 1869 to 1880, 6 of their 7 children died of diphtheria. Returning to Mount Pleasant in 1881, they had 3 more children. 2 of these children also died. Of the 10 children born to Anna Marie, only 2, Christian and Leonard, survived childhood. She had walked to Utah with the Willie Handcart Company, returned to Nebraska in a wagon train, and in 1881 returned to Utah by rail. Through a lifetime of hardship, it was her kindness to others and her smile that her children most remembered. She died at the age of 83 on the 3rd of September, 1929, in Hamer, Idaho, in the home of her son, Leonard. She was buried in Mount Pleasant, Utah. Andrew Oleson moved to Mount Pleasant in 1859 and helped to build a fort there. In 1874, he married Anna Marie Jensen, and they moved to Chester, where they purchased a farm. Later, he moved to Spring City. He and his wife had 8 children. He died on the 13th of May, 1936, in Spring City, Utah, at the age of 86. In March of 1856, as the family prepared to continue their journey from Copenhagen, Karen Oldesdotter had a dream that one of her sisters back in Tornved was dead, and they were preparing the funeral. She returned home and found it was just as she had dreamed, so she stayed and helped train the children. The family lost contact, and the search for her descendants goes on today.